I've been interested in this topic actually since I was fairly young. Not the sexual violence research part, but the peer network part. And I remember when I was probably about 14 or 15, I was watching the nightly news and I saw coverage of a study that had just come out at that time that linked social network diversity to catching a cold. Basically, they found that people who have more diverse social networks, so they're kind of active in more social roles, when they were exposed to a cold virus, they were significantly less likely to come down with the actual symptoms, which I was like, that's kind of shocking. And it kind of stuck with me as I grew up, and ultimately I went to graduate school. That's when I actually did get interested in studying sexual violence prevention, and I started finding an interesting pattern. This is campus sexual violence perpetration, self-reports from college men, and you can see along the bottom that's adolescence, so the high school years, all the way up to their year 4 of college. And then you have basically level of sexual violence on the y-axis. And you'll see one thing that's kind of nice is, like others have stated, most college men don't perpetrate any sexual violence. In this study, it ranged from any kind of coercive sexual behavior, so verbal coercion, badgering, lying, all the way up to attempted rape and rape. Most guys aren't perpetrating that. But among those who are, a majority of them, it's about 20%, they have these dynamic trajectories. And when I found this, and maybe some of you still kind of feel like, once you're a perpetrator, always a perpetrator, but I wasn't finding that at all. We do have some guys who were perpetrating consistently, but actually most of the perpetrators had these dynamic trajectories across time, in that they perpetrated before coming to college, but then once they got on campus, they stopped perpetrating for some reason. And then there was this other group that unfortunately took their place. They hadn't perpetrated at all before coming to college, but once they got on campus, they started perpetrating for the first time. And I was like, that's interesting, and you can see kind of the broken red circle there. What's going on in that transition to college? As Tony talked about, alcohol is going on. We do know that there's a lot of evidence that a lot of students start drinking heavily for the first time once they get to college. And I found support for that too. So alcohol is one piece of it, and some of the other individual factors. But I was kind of more interested, again, kind of going back to my childhood curiosity around social networks. It's like, so what's happening with those context changes when these college guys are moving to campus, hanging out with different people in a different setting? What kind of role is that playing in these transitions? So I'm going to talk about kind of 2 aspects of social networks, again, just briefly. One is network density, which is, just generally how tight-knit a peer group is. So how many links there are, and you're familiar with this, like how close a group is, and closer groups tend to share the same standards. They have similar attitudes, beliefs, and values. That's for 2 reasons. One, they select each other. Birds of a feather flock together. You've probably heard that. That's actually one of those sayings that's true. There's a lot of research behind that one. Opposites attract actually has some support, but not nearly as much as birds of a feather flock together. That'll probably be the only thing you remember from this talk, by the way. I shouldn't have said that. So that's network density. Network diversity, I just explained. Again, it's the number of active roles you play. So you could be active with a friend group. You could be an active student, so you're active in a classroom and you have peers there. You could have a job, volunteer work, religious organizations. So that's what I mean when I talk about multiple domains. Basically, you're getting information from different groups of people, and that'll also be important in a few minutes. So I'm not the first person to talk about. I thought I was when I was young, but then I quickly realized other people had been talking about this medical model or public health model for understanding violence for a while. And it's helpful to understand how violence spreads. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that violent behavior spreads much like a contagious disease or a virus spreads from person to person through communities, those types of things. And it also, like this kind of medical or network understanding of sexual violence in this case, can also help with prevention programming, help us develop maybe peer-based interventions, or interventions like Tony mentioned that maybe go beyond that individual level. So that's why I think that this research is promising. And people have talked about the idea of peer influence on sexual violence among college students and even beyond, like in community populations. For a long time, it was just the sociologists, but they would tell you, hey, there's nothing different about sexual violence. I mean, we know that people who drink coffee just tend, on average, to hang out with other people who drink coffee. It's this sociological phenomenon called homophily. People, again, birds of a feather flock together. So there isn't necessarily anything specific about sexual violence, but one thing that, is kind of interesting is that, I can look out, and if I kind of came around and, in my researcher ways, like I have a flip chart, and I could keep track of who at each table is drinking coffee, and maybe I could just kind of test this idea that maybe people who are drinking coffee tend to sit together at meetings or something like that. But drinking coffee is a fairly outward expression, right? People aren't hiding it, it's pretty apparent. Sexual violence, generally speaking, is something that, doesn't happen out in the open at, say, a meeting or something like that. Obviously, we have some forms of harassment that are happening in specific contexts like bars and parties, but again, it's a little bit more isolated than other social behaviors. So that's why I kind of look to some of Tony's work and the work that she's done with some of her students that have really uncovered, I think, the link between peer attitudes and individual sexual violence, and that's really the comments that they make that objectify women. So it's just how they talk about women, how they kind of negotiate those interactions. It's in a very specific way, and it's an objectifying way, as Catherine kind of pointed out, treating women as objects, and just talking about them with a general level of hostility. So that's probably what's driving that relationship between peer violence and individual violence in this type of context, this gendered violence. And looking at some of my own data, this bears out over time. Again, I wanted to understand that, those interesting dynamic trajectories. So applying some of Tony's ideas, I looked at some data that I have, and you can see across time, before college and then into college, you see that the blue line is people who, college guys who perpetrate before college, but not during college. And the red line is people who perpetrated after college but hadn't perpetrated before college. And then the levels, or the y-axis, is their peers' support for sexual violence at each time point. So basically what we're seeing is these overlapping trends of peer support that coincide with when these guys are likely to perpetrate. So their perpetration levels are varying across time, along with their peer support for sexual violence, which again, if you think about it the way we've discussed it this morning, isn't so surprising, because we know, especially college guys are pretty open to peer influence in a lot of different ways. So Tony already talked about this. It was a 50-50 shot. I was like, is Tony going to talk about this? I don't know. It's really important for my talk, but I'm actually happy she did, because I can kind of move through it quickly and get to some more of the information. But I guess it just underscores the importance of this model for understanding sexual violence perpetration. Again, this is the Confluence Model. You've got the two pathways. You've the hostile masculinity pathway and the impersonal sex pathway that lead to sexual violence. Again, Tony already told you about that. So the first set of findings, I really wanted to, again, go beyond the peer influences and really look at the structure of these men's peer networks to understand how the structure of the networks above and beyond their peers' attitudes were impacting their sexual violence perpetration. So the first one I'll kind of focus on here is peer network density. So here again, this is why I had it up, because I adapted the Confluence model much the same way that Tony did, and kind of, hey, this is the gold standard in the research literature. Let's see how this additional aspect of peer networks fits in with what we already know about sexual violence. And actually, I read some of Tony's papers for information on how to do that, how to kind of adapt that model. So it was really helpful. So you see the Confluence model here, the two pathways, and then I added in the peer attitudes, and then the peer network density. Peer network density, at the beginning, I was thinking it's going to be a moderator, more tight-knit peer groups. The peers are going to have more of an influence over the individual's attitudes, and that's ultimately going to lead them to be, say, more or less sexually violent. What I ended up finding, and this is an altogether too complicated slide, especially for people on the back, so I'll just kind of walk you through the main points here. I've actually got a slide that I'll just go ahead and kind of flip to that has the main points, and I'll back up a little bit so everyone can see. Basically, having peers who support sexual violence, it leads to increases in individual sexual violence, and I found that kind of works through the hostile masculinity pathway. So basically, if you have peers who support sexual violence, that's going to lead to more general hostility and objectification toward women in an individual college guy in this case, and that is going to lead to more sexual violence. So basically, peers are changing individual attitudes, and that's contributing to sexual violence. In that effect, I did find it was what we say moderated by network density. So what that means, I'll flip back to this slide. What we have here is basically how peer network density, either low or high on the bottom there. You see basically there's some movement. And what this is telling you is if you have either a group of friends, if you're a college guy, who are just kind of moderately accepting of sexual violence toward women, or even not accepting at all, so a really pro-social group who are against violence toward women, that's going to be a protective factor for you. Just in and of itself, having that tight-knit, I want to say supportive, but that's an interpretation, but having that tight-knit peer network with either average attitudes or really pro-social attitudes is going to lead to better outcomes for an individual college guy. So again, this is in line with a lot of the medical research that we see that suggests that having strong social networks is a protective factor. And one other thing, we talk in the States, we've been talking about locker room talk a lot kind of lately in the last couple of years. It's coming up again with the Supreme Court nomination. Most guys in the surveys that we give out are kind of falling in the moderate to low support for sexual violence. So although there are different constituencies that want to say that, all guys are saying this stuff in these kind of locker room contexts or whatever, that's not what we're finding. Actually, most guys are very kind of against sexual violence, and they're not supportive of those types of behaviors. So I already said this. Okay, so the last part I want to talk about is network diversity. Again, that's how many active roles a guy is engaged with. So here again, we've got an adaptation of the Confluence Model. Right here, I just used the hostile masculinity pathway because I could see from past research that that's really where the action is in terms of the peer network, is really dictating how men are thinking about women, if they're objectifying them, if they're feeling hostile toward them or not. So basically here we've got peer rape justification, which is, again, peer attitudes supporting sexual violence. That predicts sexual violence basically every way that it could in these analyses. So it's affecting sexual violence rates directly. It's also affecting them indirectly, as we saw in the last study, although these are completely different data, by the way. It's affecting sexual violence indirectly, again, through that hostile masculinity pathway. But again, there's a lot of studies that kind of demonstrate this. What's new with this study was this social network diversity. Social network diversity, again, was a protective factor. The laser doesn't really show up here, but you can see those negative signs if you're close enough, or you'll just take my word for it. The effects were negative, so basically what that means is when you have a more diverse social network, the guys are less likely to perpetrate sexual violence, and if they are unfortunately a perpetrator, they perpetrate less sexual violence. And that worked through the hostile masculinity pathway as well, and it also directly reduced sexual violence. And this is basically what I just said for those of you who couldn't see the slide in the back. So. Okay, so taken together, I know it's kind of a blitz of information, apologies for that, but I think the take-home points are pretty straightforward from this. Above and beyond the content of peer groups' attitudes, we know that peer attitudes impact individual attitudes. We've been talking about peer pressure and the effects that has, since, in my memory, the mid-'80s, probably before that. Catherine kind of talked about some of those effects with her observational work in the bar settings very clearly. So, we know that's, peer influence is a thing. But what's really interesting is that above and beyond the effects of the actual content of a peer group's attitudes, the actual structure of that peer group, specifically how dense the peer group is, how diverse the network is, actually can fortunately help reduce sexual violence. When, in this case, college guys have a supportive, tight-knit, diverse peer group, they're less likely to perpetrate, which has obvious implications for prevention programming, for understanding the spread of sexual violence, and ultimately bringing it together to limit the spread of sexual violence. So just a couple things that need to happen in the future, kind of a la Tony's points about, this is kind of a moving train. I feel like we're moving in the right direction. We're learning quite a lot about this, but there's still a lot of questions that are left to be answered. And Tony already said this, we need to understand what this looks like over time. We're starting to, like with the trajectory work that I showed you, understanding men's perpetration rates over time, but we need to understand how the social network is kind of feeding into that. My results are getting a little bit closer to understanding that dynamic, the one group decreasing their sexual violence rates while the other group is increasing it, but it would be nice to get even closer to understand what that looks like, again, to help with prevention and intervention programs. A lot of the research in this area is self-report. So we're asking college guys to report their perceptions, their peers' attitudes. That's, it's a plus and a minus because we know that, perception is a big part of what influences individuals. So if I think, my friends are drinking a case of beer whenever they go out, then that's what's going to impact my behavior. If my friends are drinking less than that, it doesn't necessarily matter because it's all about what I'm perceiving. So in terms of what we're finding here, if you think your friends are supportive of sexual violence, then that's what's going to impact your behavior. But it would be good to actually get self-report from the whole network to really understand some of those other dynamics. And also understand what's going on with the women in these social networks and in these peer networks. To understand, there's a lot of questions in the field about, that we talked about, women who drink more heavily are at greater risk for sexual violence, and we try to be really careful with that finding because we don't want to victim blame or anything like that. Well, people who drink a lot tend to hang out with each other, so it could be that women who are drinking at higher rates are more likely to associate with men who are drinking at higher rates, and as we learned from Tony's talk, those men are more likely to be sexually violent, so it really could be a social network issue kind of piled on top of the alcohol use findings. So that is all I have so far, and I think I'm right about on time. So I'll just say thank you, and thank you again for inviting me.